Good morning and welcome. We are kicking off another week of video devotions to the book of 2 Samuel with 2 Samuel chapter 15. So we are so glad to have you with us today. Now, if you've been reading along with us in recent days, you'll know that the last few chapters of 2 Samuel have really focused on King David's relationship with one of his sons, Absalom. And you'll know that a few chapters ago, it's a really long story. If you're interested, you can go back and listen to previous days' devotions. But there was this issue that developed, that's probably a minor way to put it, an issue that developed between King David and Absalom. It was an issue that meant that Absalom actually had to leave Jerusalem. He had to leave all of Israel for a number of years before his father David would forgive him. And what we talked about in our last devotion in 2 Samuel 14 was how difficult it was for King David to forgive his son Absalom, how difficult it was for David to reconcile with his son, to restore his relationship with him. And where we left off on Thursday with 2 Samuel 14 was the story of David restoring his relationship with Absalom, of Absalom being able to come in the presence of his father, King David. Well, if you've read along with us this morning in 2 Samuel 15, you'll know that this relationship that had been restored between King David and Absalom didn't remain restored for very long. And I say that because here in chapter 15, Absalom conspires to take the throne from his father David. Absalom tries to become king. And he's moderately successful, at least successful for a while in his plan, because he does make David flee. Actually, David chooses to flee. And what I want to talk about this morning is just the decision that David makes, how David chooses to respond when his son does something to try to steal the throne from him. Because David had lots of options, I'm sure, about how he would respond. He probably could have confronted Absalom, maybe even threatened him with the army to put him back in line. But instead, David allows Absalom to carry out his plan. David flees from Israel, at least for a time. David allows Absalom to believe he's become king. And that got me thinking, when individuals in our lives, whether they're friends, whether they're close acquaintances, or whether they're people we don't really know at all, do things to sin against us, do things that hurt us, do things that harm us, how do we respond? Do we challenge others when we are challenged by them? Or are we like David? Do we choose not to confront those who sin against us, but instead do we place our trust and our hope in God? Do we trust that God will provide for us, that God's will be done, and that God will act on our behalf? And for so long as we've read through 1 Samuel and now 2 Samuel, we've talked about this remarkable faith that King David has. And I think it's that faith that informs how he responds to Absalom here in chapter 15. Instead of trying to take matters into his own hands, and instead of challenging his son, and instead of trying to overthrow his son, and instead of doing anything drastic, David accepts what his son has done. David trusts that God's will would be done, and God places his hope in God's hands. So the next time somebody does something to you that hurts your feelings, that hurts you personally, something that's wrong, when somebody does something to hurt you, remember that you always have a choice about how you'll respond. Will you be like David? Will you continue to trust in God's faithfulness even when it's difficult to understand how God is being faithful to you? Will you learn from David's example? So go in peace, and we'll see you on Thursday for 2 Samuel chapter 16.